Our next speakers, well, actually, Suzanne's going to speak. Suzanne, Menzies-Culling, and Tony Culling. So Suzanne has been involved with many important justice and anti-racism groups, an organisation called FiekeMovies works, and back in the 1980s worked with Tony at Corso. Suzanne and Yoka were founding members of Te Whare Pūnamu Dunedin Women's Refuge in 1976, and Tony was there as well. But my memories of that time are a little mixed up because he was also my teacher.
Kia ora Yoka, kia ora to you again. Ngā mihi kia koutou katoa, it's te waiho matariki. This time of matariki is really fitting and appropriate. We should be remembering Yoka. And when Fika approached me and she said it was going to happen on the 25th of June, I looked at the calendar and I thought, oh yay, it's matariki, how cool. Really a good time to remember Yoka. I didn't know that it was also around your birthday time at that stage. So Yoka was a groundbreaker. She was a very creative person, as we've heard, and a strong advocate for women. And I'm asked to speak by her family about time working with her in the 1970s as a group of us worked to set up Women's Refuge here in Dunedin. So Yoka should be remembered as the force behind the establishment of the Dunedin Women's Refuge, the woman who arrived at our Working Women's Alliance meeting in 1975 and laid down a challenge to us to organise a safe place for women and children who were suffering violence. Now, Working Women's Alliance was a group of mothers, housewives and working women in the workforce who had come together to support each other in their various struggles. And so we were an activist group who used to go and pick at Woolworths for excess packaging, or they weren't paying their staff properly who worked in the cafe and that sort of stuff. We also set up the Women's Housewives Boycott. So that was the stuff we were doing. So we were a bit perplexed when this woman arrived, demanding that we set up a refuge for women, because that was like, we're not into social work, so I don't know that we're going to be there. Anyway, I think this was probably the first time I met Yoka. She was a member of the Leading Collective for Women, as was one of our members of the Working Women's Alliance, a woman called Shirley Coops. And Shirley was also Dutch and an avowed communist, the first one I'd ever met actually. And I think it was this connection that Shirley had with Yoka through the Collective for Women that brought Yoka to approach us to do something about violence in the home. Anyway, Yoka came to our meeting with a woman called Iris Tyson, who had recently left an abusive husband and had gone for help with her 3 children to the Salvation Army. So Iris had 2 daughters and a son, and the problem that she faced within the Salvation Army was that if a boy was 12 years or older, they weren't allowed to stay in the area for the families. They had to be go and sleep in the dormitory with the old drunks. And Iris was very upset. The boy was traumatised. She found it really confronting. She was very angry and said, you know, I don't know where she met Yoka. She met Yoka somewhere, and Yoka took it upon herself that she was going to do something about it. By the way, Yoka had read this book by an English woman called Erin Pitsey, and the book was called Scream Quietly or the Neighbours Will Hear, and she was involved in setting up a women's shelter in London, this woman Erin Pitsey. So this is a book that Yoka had to read, and she was totally inspired and motivated by the possibility of what could happen here in Dunedin. So against our initial inclinations, she convinced us, most of us who are all young women, that we needed to step up as no one else was going to. So reluctantly we agreed to call a public meeting to see whether there were other people around who had the same concerns and whether they would be prepared to get involved. At the time, I think, Yoka knew of a women's group attached to the University in Auckland who had set up a safe house for university women. So she was in contact with them and also visited them while she went to Auckland and saw how they were doing things. Anyway, she'd come to see us in 1975, and it took us a few months to get ourselves together. So in late February 1976, we had a public meeting in a lounge in a flat I think it's in the corner of Lovelock Ave and Dundas Street. One of our members said before it was her flat. I don't know what she did with her flatmates for the night, but I think that's where we had our first public meeting. For some inexplicable reason, I was chosen to chair this meeting, and I had to tell you I was terrified. I was only 26, in fact I just turned 26, I had a baby of a year-old. I was just newly pregnant with my second child, and because of the culture of the day, which Jocelyn has alluded to, I expected there was going to be a large number of outraged men confronting us women as we tried to set up a women's refuge. So I got Tony to come along. He was the only man in the room as it turned out. I just needed a friendly face, like someone I could look at and think, it's going to be all right, whatever happens, it's going to be all right. So, yes, I guess the time of the 70s, it was still this really old-fashioned stuff of a man's house is his castle, the men at the head of the family. And so what a man and wife did to each other in the privacy of their own home was private, and no one was really supposed to speak about it. And at that time too, rape in marriage was not even a crime. So this is the kind of times we're talking about. So I had no idea he was going to turn up at the meeting, and it was really good that Tony was there. But the trouble was that after the meeting happened, it was reported in the paper, we actually started getting calls the very first morning from women looking to escape bad marriages, violent relationships. And I just want to acknowledge the women who were at that meeting who put their hands up. That collective was formed that night, and I'm not sure if I met everybody, but this would have been called Lizzie Price, Frances Johnson, Heather Cunningham-Burnett, Juanita Ketchell, a couple of feminist students, Annie Tuck and Marianne Quinn, who I see here tonight, and also myself and Yoka. So we were the first collective, and we started to meet every week in someone's home, plotting and planning as to how to find the support and the money and the skills that were going to be needed to do this work. Now, as I said, we started getting calls from women who were desperate to get away from violent marriages, and this was quite a challenge because we had no house, we had nowhere for them to go, but we couldn't turn our backs on them. And I think Eric actually talked about how Yoka, along with myself and Frances Johnson, brought women and their children into our homes for them to have a safe place. And so that gave them time to have a break and have a bit of a rest, and then we would take them to social welfare to organise them to get benefits and find food lawyers, take them to find somewhere to rent, find places for them to live with their kids. And I have to say, we did approach some of the women lawyers in town who didn't really want to have anything to do with us because they didn't want to be pigeonholed as dealing with women's problems and domestic problems. And I just want to acknowledge a man here, a guy called Mike Nidd, who was a young Lebanese lawyer. I think he worked for Farry & Co. And he was an amazing support. He looked after all our women who came. He would apply for legal aid and do whatever needed to be done to actually get the protection orders and all that sort of stuff. So I just want to acknowledge Mike at this stage. And because we weren't social workers or counsellors, we cared about women, and we were sure that women's support and encouragement would make a difference. We were quite naive. We didn't really know much about the psychology of violence and how difficult it was for people who've been in violent relationships to leave. But we thought, well, as it says, I am a woman, hear me roar, and we can do anything, we're invincible, so that's the place we came from. Some of the activities that Derek and I did at that time, probably with her encouragement, not even instigation, we made a visit to the manager of the Space Breweries and asked him to donate money to set up a refuge for battered women and children. It wasn't very helpful. Another brainwave of Yoka's was that we'd go down to the pubs on a Saturday afternoon and evening, shaking collection tins and asking punters to contribute. We were convinced that booze was a critical driver of violence in the home. We did collect some money, it wasn't a lot. But we also thought that domestic violence only happened in poor families. And we were quite surprised to find the very first approach we got was from the wife of a Presbyterian minister. And I think the second person who rang us was married to the president of one of the Lions clubs in Dunedin. So that shook some of our stereotypes a little from their moorings. Yoka also used her relationship with women in the Dunedin collective to get them to do automatic payments towards the setting up and running of the first refuge house, and she was also responsible for getting an automatic payment from one of the local Lions clubs which paid our weekly rent. The first refuge, I think Justin talked about that, the very first house was a tiny two-bedroom cottage in 4th Street, which we moved into in November 1976, and which we quickly outgrew. Our collective was meeting every week, and we included the women who lived in the house with us. They came to all the meetings that we had, and that's when we drew up the roster for how the house was going to be run, who was doing the shopping, all that sort of stuff. We needed to make sure, well, we made a commitment as a collective that we would make sure there was always someone there with the woman, even through the evening. Because we never knew, even though the house was secret, we never knew when a husband would find out where we were and come to wreak whatever vengeance he decided we deserved. So we wanted to make sure that there was always someone there with the women and their kids. And I just want to acknowledge the university students, feminists, who carried the burden of all the nighttime and weekend roster work. It was them, but also some of the women in our collective who weren't mothers and weren't caregivers. So they carried a lot of the load for being on roster through the nights and through the weekends. The second refuge house was in Easter Crescent, and we moved into that the weekend before Tony and I left with our babies to go overseas for 4 years in 1978. So I remember us spending the whole day, Yoka was there, unloading trailers at Easter Crescent, so that we could get it all done in a day and get the woman out of the old place and into the new place. Yoka was still active when Refuge found its third home in Melbourne Street in 1981, I think. I was overseas still at this time. By the time many of the women volunteers were Christians, a lot of the feminists had, maybe graduated from university or shifted out of Dunedin. And the fact that they were Christians and no longer working with women from a feminist perspective, I think Yoka found quite troubling and a bit upsetting for her. In 2006, Yoka was made a life member of Te Whare Koirangu Dunedin Women's Refuge, which was formed out of the combination of Dunedin Women's Refuge and the Māori Women's Refuge, which they called Te Whare Koirangu. And that refuge was founded in the early 1980s. She was really proud to receive that honour, and the badge of 30 years of the refuge was up there on the screen before. From time to time we'd see each other after we came back from overseas. As Fieke said, we were working for Corso. I remember a few times we'd been in the Octagon supporting various protest actions against nuclear warfare for nuclear-free and independent Pacific movement. She also used to come along to our protests about the Indonesian occupation of East Timor, and also against the notorious police raids against the small village of Ruatoki in 2007. I remember her being at that protest in the Octagon as well. A number of us from Corso and Freedom Roadworks had gathered in the Octagon to highlight what had been carried out against the small Tuhoi community earlier in October. Yoka was there, and she sent photos of the banner that many of us, including children, had painted. And I'd forgotten about that. She sent a card of photos of that day, and I found it just not long ago, just after you asked me to speak, and I was cleaning out my office, and I found this card from Yoka with these photos in it. The banner on the sheets of the fabric that we were painting to send to Ruatoki read, Ka whawhai tonu mātou, aroha and solidarity from Oti. And I think aroha and solidarity sum up Yoka perfectly. So moi mai rā e hoa. He wahine toa. Rest in peace, my friend.
Kia ora tātou. same as the night of the Refuge meeting. I was very quiet. I wouldn't have been much of a sort of peaceful sort of guy. I wouldn't have been able to handle much if there's any rough stuff going on. I just wanted to pass on one little story about Yoka, and I'm just thinking here, Yoka, anytime you saw her, she just made you feel so good. She just was so welcoming, and lots of things flash back in your mind as different encounters you've had with her. But as Fieke mentioned, in 1975, it was my first year at Park High School, and I had this grade class, and Fieke was one of them. There were 24 boys and 4 girls, from what I remember. And I asked Yoka to come in and speak to the class on feminist manners, etc. And I remember outside the corridor, she grabbed me by the arm, she said, "Tony, I'm so nervous, I've never done this before." And so anyway, she goes in and she does a lovely talk to everybody, and it was well received. We didn't do a longitudinal study of the boys there, but I know 4 or 5 of them still as adults, and they survived. But yeah, she was so good, so I just thought I'd pass the story on.
Thank you. Thank you to Jocelyn and Suzanne and Tony and Michael and all those other people in nature and everyone. You really made a difference. Thank you. As well as